What happens when the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy dismiss humanity as primitive, only to discover that our greatest strength isn't our technology or our weapons, but something they never expected? When Ambassador Zara Chen married Prince Kethvar of the Altarian Empire, the Galactic Council saw it as nothing more than a political stunt. Little did they know that this simple human would soon become the catalyst for the most shocking revelation in galactic history. This is the story of how one woman's unwavering spirit not only saved her marriage, but exposed the galaxy's greatest secret, and why every alien civilization now whispers the same phrase in hushed, reverent tones. Never underestimate a human protecting what they love. The universe was about to learn that when you mock a human's family, you don't just face one person's wrath, you face the entire unstoppable force of human determination. The great ceremonial hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with tension that could be felt across 3 star systems. Representatives from 47 different species had gathered for what many considered the most ridiculous spectacle in diplomatic history. Ambassador Zara Chen, a human woman barely 5 feet tall with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, stood at the center of it all, her hand clasped firmly in that of Prince Kethvar, the towering blue-skinned heir to the Altarian Empire. The whispers started immediately. The Zalathi delegation, their crystalline forms refracting light in patterns that indicated deep amusement, transmitted their thoughts through harmonic frequencies that roughly translated to mockery. The Vorthan representative, a massive creature that resembled a cross between a bear and a dragon, let out what could only be described as a snort of contempt. Even the normally diplomatic Etherian floating orbs pulsed with colors that any experienced galactic citizen would recognize as derision. High Chancellor Vex Thul of the Dominion Coalition rose from his elevated platform, his forearms gesturing dramatically as his voice boomed across the hall in the end. His species, the Kethmori, had ruled the galaxy's eastern sectors for over 3,000 years, and his tone carried all the authority of that ancient lineage. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, his voice carrying that particular inflection that all politicians across the galaxy seemed to master, regardless of species. "We are gathered here to witness what the Altarian Empire claims is a union of equals. A marriage that will supposedly strengthen the bonds between our civilizations and bring humanity into our grand alliance." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled delegates before focusing on Zara with barely concealed disdain. "Yet what do we see before us? A primitive species that has barely mastered interstellar travel, offering us one of their kind as if she were some rare curiosity to be displayed in our museums." The laughter that followed was not kind. It rippled through the hall like a wave, growing stronger as each delegation joined in. The Zeronians clicked their mandibles in rhythmic patterns that served as their version of mocking applause. The gaseous nebulari pulsed their containment suits in synchronization, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't so clearly meant as ridicule. Prince Kethvar's jaw tightened, his normally calm demeanor showing the first cracks of anger. His species aged slowly, and at 300 years old he had seen enough politics to know when he was being deliberately provoked. But before he could speak, Zara squeezed his hand gently and stepped forward. "High Chancellor," she said, her voice clear and steady despite being completely unenhanced by any technological amplification. In a hall designed for beings who communicated through everything from subsonic vibrations to electromagnetic pulses, her simple human voice seemed almost quaint. "I appreciate your concern for the strength of this alliance. Perhaps you'd like to share what specific qualifications you believe I lack." More laughter erupted, but this time it was mixed with a different kind of amusement. The kind that came from watching someone walk unknowingly into a trap. High Chancellor Vex Thul's 4 eyes gleamed with what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. "Qualifications?" he repeated, drawing out the word as if it were the punchline to some cosmic joke. "My dear primitive creature, let us start with the obvious. Your species has existed for what, a few 100,000 years? The youngest sapient species in this hall has existed for 12 million years. You have mastered exactly one type of faster-than-light travel, and that only in the last 50 years. Your longest-lived individuals barely reach a century, while the shortest-lived among us here today will see 50,000 years pass before they even reach middle age." He gestured grandly toward the assembled delegates. "The Vorthans have mastered the art of reshaping entire star systems to suit their needs. The Etherians have transcended physical form and exist as pure energy. The Xylothi have created pocket dimensions where they conduct experiments that would take your entire species' lifetimes to even comprehend. And you, little human, you offer us what exactly? What could your brief, limited existence possibly contribute to civilizations that have been perfecting the arts of war, diplomacy, science, and culture since before your planet even developed multicellular life?" Even Prince Kethvar seemed unsure of what she might say. The political marriage had been his idea, born from genuine affection he had developed for her during her time as Earth's first galactic ambassador. But faced with the combined mockery of the galaxy's greatest powers, even he wondered if perhaps he had been naive. Zara looked around the hall slowly, taking in each delegation with the kind of careful attention that made several representatives shift uncomfortably. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the enormous space despite its lack of technological enhancement. "You're absolutely right, High Chancellor. We are young. We are limited. We have only just learned to travel between the stars, while you have been doing so since before we even existed." She paused, and something in her tone made the laughter die away. "But there's something you might want to consider." "And what would that be?" Vexthal asked, clearly expecting another opportunity to demonstrate human ignorance. "We got here anyway." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge that no one quite understood how to accept. Zara continued before anyone could respond. "You're ancient, powerful, technologically advanced beyond our wildest dreams. You've had millions of years to perfect everything you do, and yet somehow, in just 50 years of trying, we managed to not only figure out how to travel between stars, but to earn a place in this hall with you. Maybe that should tell you something about what humans bring to the table." The Vorthan representative leaned forward, his massive form creating shadows that fell across half the assembly. "And what exactly do you think that is, little one?" Zara smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Prince Kethvar remember why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. It wasn't arrogance or defiance. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had learned to find strength in that position. "We don't give up," she said simply. "Ever. No matter how impossible the odds, no matter how many times we fail, no matter how many people tell us we can't do something, we keep trying, and somehow we usually find a way." The silence that followed was different from before. It was the silence of beings who had lived long enough to recognize something they hadn't expected to encounter. But High Chancellor Vexthul was not ready to concede any ground. "Pretty words," he said dismissively, "but words are all they are. Your species may have a certain persistence, I'll grant you that. But persistence without wisdom, without experience, without the deep knowledge that comes from millennia of existence, is merely stubbornness. And stubbornness, my dear primitive creature, is not a virtue that will serve you well in the complexities of galactic politics." He gestured toward Prince Kethvar with one of his 4 arms. "The prince here may find your quaint determination amusing, even charming. But when the real challenges come, when the true tests of leadership and wisdom arise, what will you do then? Will your stubbornness serve you when you must make decisions that affect the lives of trillions? Will your simple human emotions guide you when you must choose between the survival of one world and the security of 1,000 others?" The other delegates murmured their agreement, and several transmitted their agreement, and several transmitted their support through various forms of communication. The crystalline Xylothi chimed in harmonious agreement. The nebulari pulsed in synchronized approval. Even some of the more neutral delegations seemed to nod in whatever way their physiology allowed. Prince Kethvar finally stepped forward, his own voice carrying the authority of imperial bloodlines stretching back 10,000 years. High Chancellor, with respect you speak of tests and challenges as if my bride has never faced them, but perhaps you should learn something of who you are addressing before you make such assumptions. He turned to face the assembly, his blue skin taking on a deeper hue that indicated the formal invocation of royal privilege. Ambassador Chen was not chosen for this position because of political connections or family influence. She earned it by being the single most effective negotiator in human history. In her 20 years of diplomatic service, she has never failed to reach an agreement when both sides were willing to negotiate in good faith. Vexthul waved dismissively with two of his arms. Impressive for a human, perhaps, but negotiating with other humans is hardly the same as managing the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define galactic politics. Your bride may be skilled at convincing her fellow primitives to share their toys, but that hardly qualifies her to sit among the powers that shape the fate of entire sectors. The insult was deliberate and cutting, designed not just to diminish Zara but to challenge Prince Kethvar's judgment in choosing her. The political implications were clear to everyone present. If the future emperor of Alterea could be swayed by a primitive's charm, what did that say about his fitness to rule one of the galaxy's major powers? Zara felt the weight of those implications, understood that this was about much more than personal insults. This was a test of her husband's political standing, and by extension, a test of the alliance between humanity and the greater galactic community. She could see the calculation in Vexthul's eyes, the way he was using her as a weapon against Prince Kethvar's credibility, and that, more than any personal slight, ignited something deep within her that every human carried in their genetic memory. The fury of a species that had clawed its way up from the primordial soup, that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and every other catastrophe their young planet could throw at them. The rage of a people who had been told again and again that they were too small, too weak, too stupid, too primitive to matter. "You want a test?" she asked, her voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made several delegates suddenly pay closer attention. "You want to see what human stubbornness can accomplish when it's properly motivated?" High Chancellor Vexthul leaned back in his elevated seat, clearly delighted that he had finally provoked the reaction he was looking for. "By all means, little human. Show us what your primitive determination can achieve against the wisdom of the ages." Zara looked around the hall one more time, meeting the gaze of every delegate who would look at her. When she spoke, her words were calm and measured, but they carried a promise that would echo through galactic politics for generations to come. "Very well, but understand something, all of you. When you insult me, you're not just insulting one human. You're insulting my husband, my people, and everything we've worked to build here. And when you do that," she paused, letting the silence stretch until even the most arrogant delegates were hanging on her next words. "You get to learn exactly why humans don't give up. Ever." The challenge came 3 days later, delivered through official diplomatic channels with all the pomp and ceremony that the Galactic Council could muster. Ambassador Zara Chin sat in her private quarters aboard the Alterian diplomatic vessel, reading the ornately worded document that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future of human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. Prince Kethvar paced behind her, his normally graceful movements betrayed by the tension that radiated from every line of his tall frame. "This is unprecedented," he said for the 5th time in an hour. "The trials of worthiness haven't been invoked in over 2,000 years. They were created to settle disputes between species of equal standing, not to humiliate newcomers." Zara looked up from the document, her expression thoughtful rather than worried. "What exactly do these trials involve?" "The language here is deliberately vague. That's because they're meant to be tailored to the specific challenge," Kethvar explained, finally stopping his pacing to sit beside her. The Council will design 3 tests that they believe will demonstrate whether you possess the qualities necessary to serve as a bridge between humanity and the greater galactic community. And if I fail, Kethvar reached for her hand, his blue fingers intertwining with her smaller human ones. If you fail, the Council will declare our marriage a political mistake and recommend that humanity's application for full galactic citizenship be postponed indefinitely. It would effectively end any hope of your species joining us as equals rather than junior partners. Zara nodded slowly, understanding the full weight of what had been placed on her shoulders. It was a masterful political move by High Chancellor Vexthal and his supporters. They had maneuvered her into a position where backing down would be seen as an admission of human inadequacy, but accepting would almost certainly result in public humiliation that would damage human standing. There's something else, Kethvar continued reluctantly. The trials will be broadcast throughout the galaxy. Every species, every world, every colony will be watching. The Council claims it's to ensure transparency, but we both know the real reason. They want to make an example of me, Zara finished. Show the entire galaxy what happens when a primitive species gets ideas above its station. That's their plan, yes. But Zara, you don't have to do this. We can find another way, work through different diplomatic channels. This isn't the only path forward. She stood and walked to the viewport, gazing out at the stars that had once seemed so impossibly distant from her home world of Earth. Somewhere out there, billions of human beings were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their future in the galaxy hung in the balance based on the actions of one woman they had never met. What would happen to humanity if I refused the challenge? She asked without turning around. Kethvar's silence told her everything she needed to know. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of political reality. The Council would interpret it as an admission that humans recognize their limitations. Humanity would be offered associate membership, which means you would have a voice in galactic affairs, but no vote. Your species would be protected, but never truly equal. And what would happen to you? To us? Another long pause. My father would be forced to annul our marriage for political reasons. The Altarian Empire couldn't maintain its standing while allied to a species that the Council had officially deemed inadequate for full membership. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of not just her own future but that of her entire species settling on her shoulders. It was the kind of pressure that would have broken many people, the kind of moment where the rational choice was to accept a lesser position and hope for gradual improvement over the course of centuries. But humans, as she had tried to explain to the Council, didn't give up, especially not when they were fighting for their family. Tell them I accept, she said, turning back to her husband with a smile that carried all the love and determination that had brought them together in the first place. All 3 trials, full galactic broadcast, whatever they want to throw at me. Zara, are you sure? These beings have had millions of years to perfect the art of political maneuvering. They'll design the trial specifically to expose what they see as human weaknesses. Good, she replied, moving to her communication console and beginning to compose her formal response. Then they'll learn something about human strengths they didn't expect. The acceptance was transmitted within the hour, and the galaxy's reaction was immediate and predictable. The Galactic News Network, which reached every civilized world in known space, led with the story of the primitive human who had dared to accept the ancient challenge. Commentary flooded the networks, with political analysts from dozens of species weighing in on what they saw as either brave foolishness or spectacular arrogance. On HFY Prime, the insectoid population buzzed with amusement at the prospect of watching a mammal attempt to match wits with beings whose civilizations predated her species by geological ages. The floating cities of the Etherian collective pulsed with colors indicating anticipation mixed with pity. Even on the normally neutral worlds of the Traders' Alliance, betting pools opened on which trial would expose the humans' inadequacy most dramatically. But there were other reactions, quieter ones, that the major news networks didn't cover. On the Outer Rim worlds, where species struggled to make their voices heard in the Council's deliberations, beings gathered around communication devices, with something approaching hope. The Kalari, a reptilian species that had been denied full membership for 3 centuries due to their insufficient technological development, watched the coverage with interest that bordered on desperation. The mammalian Terran, whose application had been postponed indefinitely because their average lifespan was considered too short for effective long-term planning, found themselves rooting for the human despite having never met one. Meanwhile, on Earth, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Ambassador Chen had been famous among humans as their first galactic representative, but most people had thought of her role as primarily ceremonial. Now, suddenly, the entire future of human space exploration, trade, and development hung on the shoulders of one woman facing impossible odds. President Rodriguez called an emergency session of the United Earth Council, while news anchors worked overtime to explain the implications to a population that was only just beginning to understand how much they didn't know about galactic politics. Protests erupted in major cities, with some demanding that their government intervene to protect their ambassador, while others argued that Chen had exceeded her authority by accepting such a challenge. But perhaps the most interesting reaction came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Kim, a xenopsychologist at the University of Chicago, gave an interview that would later be seen as prophetic. "Everyone is focusing on what humanity brings to this challenge," she said, speaking to a reporter via hologram from her laboratory. "But I think we're asking the wrong question. The real question is what the galactic community has been missing by dismissing us so completely." "What do you mean?" the reporter asked. Dr. Kim leaned forward, her expression intense. "These alien civilizations are ancient, powerful, technologically advanced beyond our wildest dreams. But they're also set in their ways. They've been doing things the same way for millions of years, following the same patterns, thinking the same thoughts. When was the last time any of them was truly surprised? When was the last time they had to adapt to something genuinely unexpected?" She gestured toward the stars visible through her laboratory window. "Humans have been surprising each other for our entire existence. We've survived by being unpredictable, by finding solutions that nobody else would think of, by refusing to accept that something is impossible just because everyone says it is. Ambassador Chen isn't walking into this challenge to prove that humans can think like these ancient species. She's going to show them what it looks like when someone approaches their carefully designed tests from a completely different perspective." The interview was largely ignored on Earth, lost in the flood of political analysis and worried speculation. But on one particular ship traveling toward the council chambers, Prince Kethfar watched it with growing understanding and something that might have been hope. 3 days after accepting the challenge, Zara received the details of her first trial. As she read through the specifications, she began to understand exactly what kind of game the council was playing. The trial was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. She would be given access to all the same information that the council used to make decisions about galactic trade disputes. She would then have 48 hours to resolve a complex multi-species trade conflict that had been deadlocked for 3 years and involved 7 different civilizations with competing claims and incompatible needs. Her solution would be evaluated not just on its effectiveness, but on its political viability, economic sustainability, and long-term stability. It was the kind of challenge that would have been difficult for a team of experienced galactic diplomats working for months. For one human with 48 hours, it seemed impossible. "They've chosen well," Kethfar admitted as they reviewed the case materials together. "The Vorthans need the mining rights to continue their stellar engineering project, but the Zilithai claim that the mining will disrupt crystalline formations they consider sacred. The Etherians have offered to mediate, but their proposed solution would require the Nebulari to relocate 3 of their colonies, which they refused to do. The Traders Alliance wants to maintain access to the shipping lanes, but the proposed alternatives would add months to their delivery schedules and bankrupt several member species. And the Zeronians? They've threatened to withdraw from the Galactic Commerce Treaty entirely if their agricultural exports are affected by any shipping delays, which they would be under every solution that's been proposed so far. What about the Kalari and the Terran? Kethfar looked puzzled. They're not involved in this dispute. Their territories are nowhere near the contested region. Zara continued making notes, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And the council expects me to solve this in 48 hours? They expect you to try and fail publicly, demonstrating that human stubbornness is no substitute for the wisdom that comes from millennia of experience. Zara looked up from her notes, meeting her husband's eyes with an expression of calm determination. Then I guess it's time to show them what human stubbornness actually looks like when it's backed up by human creativity. I'm gonna need to talk to some people, representatives from species that aren't involved in this dispute, but who might have some interesting perspectives on the problems. Zara, what are you planning? Something that I guarantee none of these ancient, wise, experienced beings will expect, she replied, beginning to compose her first message. I'm going to solve their problem by asking the right questions, instead of accepting their assumptions about what the problem actually is. As she worked, Prince Kethvar found himself remembering Dr. Kim's interview about human unpredictability and began to wonder if perhaps the galaxy was about to learn something it had never expected to discover. 24 hours into her allotted time, Ambassador Zara Chen had done something that shocked the galactic diplomatic community to its core. Instead of focusing on the 7 species involved in the trade dispute, she had spent her time conducting interviews with 23 different species that had no direct involvement in the conflict whatsoever. The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with confusion and barely concealed amusement as reports filtered in of the human ambassador's activities. She had spoken with the insectoid Mantari about their experiences with terraforming desert worlds. She had consulted with the aquatic deepsworn about their methods for adapting to different atmospheric pressures. Most bizarrely, she had spent 3 hours in conversation with the nomadic wanderer fleets about their philosophy regarding territorial boundaries. High Chancellor Vexthul watched the proceedings from his elevated platform with growing satisfaction. The human was clearly floundering, grasping at irrelevant information because she lacked the experience to understand the real issues at stake. Her husband, Prince Kethvar, sat in the gallery looking increasingly worried as the hours ticked away. She's brilliant, he had insisted to anyone who would listen. There's a plan here. She wouldn't waste time on irrelevant species unless she had a reason. But even his supporters were beginning to doubt. The Altarian delegation exchanged concerned glances as reports came in of yet another seemingly pointless conversation between their prince's bride and some minor species from the Outer Rim territories. The galactic news networks had a field day with the coverage. Human confusion reaches new heights, read the headline on the Zeronian broadcasting system. The Etherian Collective's information network pulsed with colors indicating amused bewilderment. Even the normally respectful Terran media wondered if perhaps the human ambassador had misunderstood the nature of the challenge entirely. But if Zara was aware of the mounting skepticism, she showed no sign of it. She continued her seemingly random consultations with the same calm focus she had displayed from the beginning. Her final interview was with an elderly representative of the Drifter Collective, a species so nomadic that they had no fixed territory at all and existed entirely on generation ships that wandered between the stars. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, she told the ancient being, whose species had evolved in the depths of space rather than on any planet. I know this dispute doesn't affect your people directly. Few things affect us directly, young human, the drifter replied, its voice carrying the weight of centuries spent traversing the void between worlds. But we have learned that what seems to be a small conflict in one corner of the galaxy has a way of spreading to touch everyone eventually. What would you like to know? Your people have no fixed territory, no permanent claims to any star system or planet. How do you handle disputes over resources? The ancient being made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could survive in the vacuum of space. We don't dispute over resources, child, we share them. When one fleet finds something useful, they take what they need and leave markers for the next fleet to find. When resources are scarce, we all use less until more can be found. The galaxy is vast. There is always more if you know how to look. But what about sacred sites or strategically important locations? Sacred? The drifter's form shimmered in what Zara had learned to recognize as their equivalent of a thoughtful pause. Young one, when you have no home but the stars themselves, everywhere becomes sacred. And when everywhere is sacred, you learn to treat it all with respect rather than claiming ownership over any of it. The interview lasted another hour, and when it ended, Zara had filled dozens of pages with notes that seemed to cover everything except the specific trade dispute she was supposed to be solving. With less than 12 hours remaining, she finally returned to her quarters and began working on her solution. The galaxy watched and waited. Betting pools reached astronomical figures as species across known space wagered on exactly how spectacular the human failure would be. The Vorthans had opened a special category for betting on whether she would even present a solution at all, or simply admit defeat. High Chancellor Vextal held a private reception for selected council members, where the wine flowed freely and the conversation centered on what form of associate membership might be appropriate for humanity after this demonstration of their limitations. The consensus was that humans might make decent junior partners for mining operations or agricultural development, but clearly lacked the sophistication necessary for true galactic citizenship. "It's almost sad, really," commented Ambassador Zixthal of the Nebulary Collective, his gaseous form pulsing with colors indicating patronizing sympathy. "The female clearly has some intelligence, but she simply lacks the framework to understand problems of this complexity. 3 million years of evolution doesn't prepare a species for galactic-level politics." "Indeed," agreed Chancellor Vextal, though I must admit, her husband's faith in her is touching in its naivety. The young prince will learn, in time, that love is not enough to bridge the gaps between primitive and advanced civilizations. But in her quarters, Zara was having a very different conversation with her husband. She had spread her research across every available surface, creating what looked like the most chaotic filing system in galactic history. Prince Kethvar stared at the seemingly random collection of notes, interviews, and data files, with growing bewilderment. "I don't understand any of this," he admitted. "Half of these species aren't even involved in the trade dispute. The other half have no relevant expertise. What does the Drifter Collective's philosophy about territory have to do with mining rights in the Zeta Reticuli sector?" Zara looked up from her work, her eyes bright with excitement and exhaustion. "Everything," she said simply. "That's what none of them understand. They're so focused on the specific dispute that they can't see the underlying pattern that creates all these conflicts in the first place." "What pattern?" She stood and moved to the largest display screen, calling up a galactic map that showed the territories controlled by each of the major species. "Look at this! Really look at it! What do you see?" "What do you see?" Kethvar studied the map carefully. "I see the established territorial boundaries of the 47 member species of the Galactic Council, along with the disputed regions and the neutral zones maintained for trade purposes. Now look at this." She overlaid another map showing the locations of the 93 species that weren't full council members, the ones classified as developing civilizations or associate members. The pattern that emerged was striking. Every major territorial dispute in the galaxy occurred in regions where non-council species had been displaced or marginalized. Every trade conflict involved shipping lanes that had been established without consulting the species that actually lived in those regions. Every resource dispute centered on materials that had been claimed by council members from systems originally inhabited by someone else. "The Council has been solving these conflicts the same way for millions of years," Zara explained, her voice growing excited as she outlined her discovery. "They negotiate between the major powers, find some compromise that satisfies the species with political influence, and ignore everyone else. But those ignored species don't just disappear. They adapt, they migrate, they find new ways to survive. And eventually their needs come into conflict with the neat little agreements the Council has made." Prince Kethvar stared at the overlapping maps with growing understanding. "You're saying that every dispute is really the same dispute. The Council keeps treating the symptoms while ignoring the disease." And the disease is that they've created a system where 47 species make decisions that affect hundreds of others and then act surprised when those decisions create new problems. She pulled up specific data on the current trade dispute. The Vorthans want mining rights, but they never consulted the 3 non-council species whose migration routes pass through that sector. The Zalathi claim the crystalline formations are sacred, but they established that claim after displacing the Kalari, who actually evolved in that system and have a much older connection to it. But how does that help us solve the immediate problem? Even if you're right about the underlying pattern, the Council isn't going to restructure galactic politics just because one human points out the flaws in their system. Zara smiled, and Kethvar recognized the expression from their first meeting. It was the look of someone who had found the solution that everyone else had missed because they were looking in the wrong direction. They don't have to restructure anything, she said. They just have to stop assuming that non-council species don't have anything to contribute to the solution. She pulled up her communication records from the past 24 hours. The Mantari have developed techniques for extracting minerals without disturbing surrounding formations. They've been using these methods for centuries, but nobody ever asked them about it because they're not considered technologically advanced enough to matter. The Deep Sworn have created a shipping route optimization system that could reduce transit times through the disputed sector by 40%, but they've never been consulted because their territory isn't considered strategically important. Dan and the Wanderers? They've developed the most sophisticated resource-sharing protocols in the galaxy. But nobody pays attention because they don't claim fixed territories. The Kalari have maintained detailed historical records of the crystalline formations that show exactly which areas are truly sacred and which ones were just claimed for political reasons. The Terran have agricultural techniques that could eliminate the Ziranians' dependence on the shipping routes entirely. Prince Kethvar sat down heavily, staring at his wife with a mixture of awe and disbelief. You're going to propose involving all of them in the solution. I'm going to propose something much more radical than that, Zara replied, turning back to her screens with renewed energy. I'm going to solve this specific dispute in a way that demonstrates why the Council's approach creates these problems in the first place. And I'm going to do it using knowledge and resources that have been available all along, but which they've been systematically ignoring because they come from species they consider inferior. With less than 8 hours remaining, she began composing her formal proposal. As she worked, Prince Kethvar found himself thinking about the Drifter representative's words about the galaxy being vast, with always more resources if you knew how to look. Perhaps, he thought, the problem wasn't that there weren't enough solutions. Perhaps the problem was that the Council had forgotten how to look beyond their own assumptions about who was worth listening to. The next morning, as representatives from across the galaxy gathered to witness what most expected to be a spectacular failure, Zara Chen prepared to present a solution that would challenge not just their expectations, but the fundamental assumptions that had governed galactic politics for millions of years. The great amphitheater of the Galactic Council had never held so many beings at once. Every seat was filled with additional viewing platforms hastily constructed to accommodate the unprecedented demand for witness positions. Representatives from species that hadn't attended a council session in centuries had made the journey specifically to watch the human ambassador's inevitable failure. The numbers were staggering. Across the galaxy, it was estimated that over 2 trillion beings were tuned in to watch the proceedings through various forms of communication networks. On 1,000 worlds, public viewing areas had been established where entire populations gathered to witness what most considered either the most audacious display of primitive arrogance in galactic history or the most elaborate public humiliation ever orchestrated by the Council. High Chancellor Vexthal took his position at the central podium, his forearms gesturing dramatically as his voice echoed through the amphitheater and across the galactic communication grid. Esteemed colleagues, beings of wisdom from across the known galaxy, we gather today to witness the conclusion of the first trial in the Trials of Worthiness, as requested by the human ambassador Zara Chen. The camera feeds focused on Zara as she sat calmly in the defendant's chair. looking remarkably composed for someone whose failure would effectively end her species' hopes for galactic equality. Beside her, Prince Kethvar maintained the stoic expression expected of all Terran royalty, but those who knew him could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The challenge was simple, Vexthul continued. Resolve the Zeta Reticuli trade dispute that has deadlocked our most experienced negotiators for 3 years. Provide a solution that addresses the legitimate needs of all 7 involved species while maintaining political viability and economic sustainability. He paused for dramatic effect, his gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. The human ambassador has submitted her proposal. Before we examine it, I think it's important to acknowledge the creativity of her approach. Rather than consulting with experts in galactic trade law or experienced diplomatic mediators, she chose to spend her time speaking with species that have no involvement in the dispute, and, in many cases, no relevant expertise. Laughter rippled through the assembly. Just as Vexthul had intended, the crystalline Zilathi chimed their amusement in harmonious frequencies. The gaseous nebulari pulsed in synchronized entertainment. Even some of the more neutral delegates seemed to find the humans' approach charmingly naive. Nevertheless, Vexthul continued, we will examine her proposal with the same serious consideration we would give to any formal submission to this council. Ambassador Chen, please present your solution. Zara rose from her chair with the same calm grace she had maintained throughout the proceedings. As she walked to the central presentation area, her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the vast chamber. When she reached the podium, she looked out at the sea of alien faces with an expression of quiet confidence that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Thank you, High Chancellor, she began, her unenhanced human voice somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheater. Before I present my solution, I'd like to ask the Assembly a question. How many of you have actually visited the Zeta Reticuli sector? The question caught the delegates off guard. A few hands, tentacles, and various appendages were raised, but not many. Most galactic diplomats dealt with territorial and trade issues from the comfortable distance of their home worlds or the council chambers. I see, Zara continued. And how many of you have spoken with any of the non-council species that live in or near that sector? Even fewer appendages were raised this time. High Chancellor Vexthul's expression began to shift from amused condescension to irritated impatience. Ambassador Chen, he interrupted. While your questions are interesting, they seem irrelevant to the matter at hand. The dispute involves 7 council member species with legitimate territorial and commercial interests. The opinions of primitive species in the region are not a factor in resolving conflicts between civilized powers. That, Zara said quietly, is exactly the problem. She activated the holographic display system, bringing up the same galactic maps she had shown Prince Kethvar the night before. For the past 3 years, you've been trying to negotiate a solution between 7 species, working under the assumption that their competing claims represent the totality of the problem. But what if that assumption is wrong? The first map showed the current territorial boundaries in the Zeta Reticuli sector, with the disputed mining rights, shipping lanes, and sacred sites clearly marked in different colors. It was a familiar sight to everyone present, having been displayed in countless negotiation sessions over the past 3 years. This is what the conflict looks like when you only consider council member species, Zara explained. 7 different sets of claims, all legitimate according to established galactic law, all incompatible with each other. Every proposed solution requires someone to give up something they consider essential. She overlaid the second map, showing the territories and migration routes of the non-council species in the region. The effect was startling. What had appeared to be empty space on the first map was revealed to be a complex network of established routes, territorial claims, and resource usage patterns. This is what the conflict looks like when you consider everyone who actually lives there, Zara continued. The Kalari have been using the asteroid mining sites for seasonal spawning grounds for over 50,000 years. The Montari migrate through the shipping lanes during their reproductive cycles. The Terran have agricultural installations on 3 of the uninhabited worlds that the Council has been treating as empty space. Murmurs began to ripple through the assembly as delegates started to understand the implications of what they were seeing. High Chancellor Vexthal leaned forward, his 4 eyes focusing intently on the display. "Even if this is accurate," he said carefully, "it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the dispute. These non-council species lack the technological capacity to effectively utilize these resources. Council member species have both the capability and the legal standing to make productive use of the region. Do they?" Zara asked, bringing up a third display. "Let me show you something else." The new hologram displayed resource extraction efficiency data, shipping route optimization statistics, and environmental impact assessments. But instead of the expected comparison between the 7 council species, it showed data from the supposedly primitive species that had been ignored in all previous negotiations. The Mantari have developed mining techniques that extract 40% more useful materials, while leaving the surrounding environment completely intact, Zara explained. Their methods are so advanced that they can extract minerals from the same asteroids the Vorthans want to claim without disrupting the Kalari spawning grounds at all. The Terran have created shipping route algorithms that could reduce transit time through the disputed lanes by 60%, while completely avoiding the Zilathi sacred sites. The Wanderer Collective has offered to share resource distribution networks that would eliminate the Zironians' concerns about agricultural export delays. And the Deep Sworn have proposed a revolutionary new trade agreement structure that would actually increase profits for all 7 council species while giving the local inhabitants guaranteed protection for their traditional territories. For the first time in the proceedings, High Chancellor Vexthal seemed genuinely at a loss for words. Around the chamber, delegates were frantically consulting their own data sources, trying to verify the claims being made. Prince Kethfar watched his wife with growing amazement. She hadn't just found a solution to the trade dispute. She had revealed that a solution had been available all along, waiting for someone to ask the right beings the right questions. "This is all very interesting," Vexthal finally managed, "but even if these claims are accurate, implementing such a solution would require extending full negotiating rights to species that lack council membership. That would set a dangerous precedent for future disputes." "Would it?" Zara asked. "Or would it set a precedent for actually solving problems instead of just managing them?" She brought up one final display, this one showing a comprehensive analysis of galactic trade disputes over the past 1,000 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Every major conflict had followed the same cycle. Council species would make agreements that ignored local populations. Those agreements would eventually create new problems, and the Council would respond with increasingly complex negotiations that still ignored the same local populations. "You've been solving the same problem over and over again for a millennium," Zara said. "Different sectors, different species, but always the same underlying issue. You make decisions that affect hundreds of worlds, while only consulting with a few dozen species, and then you act surprised when those decisions create more problems than they solve. My solution for the Zeta Reticuli dispute is simple. Include everyone who's actually affected by the decision in making that decision. Use the advanced techniques that these primitive species have developed over thousands of years of living in that region. Create agreements that benefit everyone instead of just the species with enough political power to get seats on the council." The specific implementation involves establishing a new category of negotiating partnership for non-council species with relevant territorial interests. The Mantari would handle mineral extraction using their advanced techniques, with profits shared according to an equitable formula developed by the Wanderer Collective. The Terran would manage shipping route optimization, with the Deep Sworn coordinating trade agreements. The Kalari would maintain cultural oversight of the sacred sites, working with the Zilathi to establish protection protocols that honor both species' traditions. "Every council species gets what they need." The Vorthans get their minerals, the Zilathi protect their sacred sites, the Zironians maintain their export schedules, and everyone else's concerns are addressed as well. More importantly, you get a framework for solving future disputes that doesn't require ignoring half the affected populations. She paused, letting the implications of her proposal sink in. The only thing this solution requires is admitting that maybe, just maybe, a species doesn't have to be ancient or technologically advanced or politically powerful to have good ideas. The silence that followed was different from any that had preceded it. It was the silence of beings who had lived long enough to recognize when their fundamental assumptions about the universe had just been challenged. It was the silence of civilizations that had spent millions of years believing they were wise, suddenly confronted with the possibility that they had been systematically ignoring wisdom that was right in front of them. High Chancellor Vexthal looked around the amphitheater, seeing his own confusion reflected in faces and forms from across the galaxy. For the first time in his long political career, he genuinely didn't know what to say next. In the viewing galleries, representatives from the non-council species sat in stunned amazement. The Kalari delegation, who had been trying to get council attention for their territorial concerns for 3 centuries, could hardly believe that a human had not only listened to them, but had made their needs central to a major galactic trade agreement. The Monterey representative, whose species' advanced mining techniques had been dismissed as quaint local adaptations by council experts, found themselves looking at display screens showing their methods being praised as revolutionary innovations. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the trillions of beings watching across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds, in colonies and stations and ships throughout known space, members of species that had never been considered important enough for council membership were seeing their knowledge, their techniques, their wisdom being presented as solutions to problems that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds. For the first time in galactic history, the possibility began to emerge that maybe intelligence, wisdom, and valuable knowledge weren't the exclusive province of the ancient, powerful, and politically connected. Maybe, just maybe, there were insights to be gained from beings who had been dismissed as primitive simply because they were young or small or different. As the implications of this possibility began to spread through the galactic communication networks, High Chancellor Vexthal finally found his voice. "The Council will consider this proposal," he said, his usual commanding tone noticeably absent. "We will examine the data you've presented and determine whether your suggested approach has merit." "Of course," Zara replied with a smile that was both gracious and knowing. "But while you're considering it, you might want to ask yourselves one question, which is, if the solution was this obvious once someone bothered to ask the right beings, how many other impossible problems might have similarly obvious solutions?" That question followed them, and for the first time in millions of years, the galaxy began to wonder what other wisdom they might have been ignoring, and what other possibilities they might have missed, simply because they had never bothered to ask. 6 months after Ambassador Zara Chen's presentation to the Galactic Council, the universe had become a very different place. The changes started small, almost imperceptibly, but like ripples spreading across the surface of a vast cosmic pond, they eventually touched every corner of known space. The Zeta Reticuli Accords, as historians would later call them, had been implemented exactly as Zara proposed. The results were so spectacularly successful that even High Chancellor Vexthal was forced to publicly acknowledge their effectiveness. Mineral extraction in the sector had increased by 300% using the Montari techniques. Shipping efficiency had improved beyond all projections thanks to Terran route optimization. Most surprisingly, the cultural protections established by the Kalari-Zelothi partnership had actually enhanced the spiritual significance of the sacred sites for both species. But the real revolution wasn't in the specific success of one trade agreement. It was in the precedent it had established and the questions it had raised throughout the galaxy. On the industrial world of HFY Prime, the Vorthan Colonial Administration had begun consulting with the native silicon-based life forms about geological engineering projects. The results were transformative. Techniques that had taken the Vorthans centuries to develop could be improved dramatically by incorporating knowledge from beings who had lived in harmony with their planet's unique crystalline substrate for millions of years. The Etherian Collective, perhaps the most intellectually advanced species in the galaxy, had begun systematic outreach programs to non-council civilizations. What they discovered challenged their fundamental assumptions about consciousness and intelligence. The gaseous beings of the nebular clouds, dismissed for eons as barely sentient, turned out to have developed mathematics concepts that the Etherians were only beginning to understand. Even the proud and ancient Dominion Coalition had quietly begun incorporating primitive techniques into their military strategies. The Terran understanding of rapid adaptation proved invaluable for special operations, while Wanderer navigation methods enhanced their fleet coordination beyond anything their traditional approaches had achieved. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in the council chambers themselves. For the first time in recorded galactic history, non-council species were being granted advisory positions on major policy decisions. The process wasn't smooth. Ancient prejudices don't disappear overnight, but it was happening. Ambassador Chen had become something she had never intended to be, the most famous human in galactic history. Interview requests flooded in from news networks across dozens of star systems. Universities that had never before shown interest in human perspectives were offering her guest lectureships. Several species had formally requested that Earth establish diplomatic missions in their territories. She declined most of the attention, preferring to focus on her original job as humanity's galactic representative. But the impact of her actions continued to reverberate throughout known space. The second and third trials of the Trials of Worthiness had been quietly canceled. High Chancellor Vexthal had announced that the first trial had adequately demonstrated the candidate's qualifications for galactic citizenship. Privately, sources within the council suggested that the remaining trials had been designed to test traditional diplomatic and military thinking, and the council wasn't certain they wanted to see what other assumptions the human might challenge. Prince Kethvar watched his wife with growing amazement as the months passed. The quiet, determined woman he had fallen in love with had somehow become the catalyst for the largest shift in galactic politics in recorded history. But what impressed him most wasn't the fame or the accolades. It was that she remained essentially unchanged by it all. "Any regrets?" he asked one evening as they stood together on the observation deck of their diplomatic vessel, watching the stars wheel slowly past. "About what?" she replied, not taking her eyes off the infinite vista before them. "About accepting the challenge, about risking everything on the chance that you could prove humans belonged in the galaxy." She was quiet for a long moment, and Kethvar began to wonder if he had touched on something she preferred not to discuss. Finally, she turned to face him with that same small smile he had seen on their first meeting. "I didn't prove that humans belonged in the galaxy," she said softly. "I proved that the galaxy needed to expand its definition of who belongs. That's not how the news networks are reporting it. Half of them are calling you the most brilliant diplomat in galactic history. The other half are saying you've single-handedly revolutionized interspecies relations. Maybe I have, but not because I did anything particularly brilliant or revolutionary. I just asked questions that apparently nobody had bothered to ask before." She turned back to the stars, her expression thoughtful. "Do you know what the real tragedy is in all of this? It's not that these ancient, powerful civilizations were ignoring valuable knowledge and perspectives. It's that they had convinced themselves that being ancient and powerful meant they didn't need to learn anything new. And now they're starting to remember something that humans never had the luxury of forgetting. That survival means adaptation, and adaptation means being willing to learn from anyone who has something to teach you." The conversation was interrupted by an incoming communication alert. Prince Kethvar frowned as he checked the source identifier. "It's from the council chambers. Priority diplomatic channel." Zara sighed, recognizing the tone that meant their quiet evening was about to be disrupted by galactic politics. What crisis needs the human perspective now? The holographic projection that materialized showed High Chancellor Vexthal, but his usual commanding presence was notably absent. He looked tired, uncertain, and perhaps even a little humble. "Ambassador Chen, Prince Kethvar, I apologize for the intrusion. But we have a situation that requires consultation. Dotted. What kind of situation? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew. We've received a communication from the Outer Spiral territories. A group of previously unknown species have made contact and are requesting dialogue about joining the galactic community. The problem is, he paused, looking uncomfortable. They're asking specifically for human representation in the negotiations. Prince Kethvar raised an eyebrow. They want humans to represent them? How do they even know about us? Apparently, word of Ambassador Chen's success has spread throughout regions of space we didn't even know were inhabited. These new species have been watching our communications networks and studying our political structures. They've concluded that humans are the only Council-affiliated species likely to take their perspectives seriously. Zara felt a familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation. How many species are we talking about? The individuals doesn't understand. 43 confirmed, with indications that there may be dozens more. They represent civilizations we've never encountered, technologies we don't understand, and perspectives that could vex. They'll struggled with the words. That could change everything we think we know about intelligence, consciousness, and civilization itself. And they want me to represent them. They're offering to share their knowledge and technologies freely, but only if they can be assured that their voices will be heard and their unique perspectives will be respected. Prince Kethvar looked at his wife with a mixture of pride and concern. You realize what this means? If you accept this role, you won't just be representing humanity anymore. You'll be speaking for dozens of previously unknown civilizations. I know, Zara replied quietly. Then, addressing the Chancellor directly, what does the Council want from me? Vex Tool's image flickered slightly, and when it stabilized, his expression had changed. For the first time since she had met him, he looked at her with something approaching respect. The Council wants to formally request that you serve as Special Ambassador for New Species Integration. The position would give you unprecedented authority to negotiate on behalf of non-Council civilizations and to establish new protocols for evaluating membership applications. It would also, he continued, require you to travel to the Outer Spiral territories and make contact with species that may be completely unlike anything we've ever encountered. The risks are significant, and the political implications are substantial. Zara looked at her husband, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of love and concern she felt herself. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even about humanity. This was about the future of galactic civilization itself. If I accept, what happens to Earth? To humanity's integration into the galactic community? Humanity would be granted full Council membership immediately, Vexthul replied. Your actions have already demonstrated that your species brings valuable perspectives to galactic governance. The formal recognition would simply acknowledge what has become obvious to everyone involved. And if I decline, then we'll muddle through with traditional diplomatic approaches and hope we don't make the same mistakes we've been making for the past 1,000,000 years. The silence stretched between them as Zara considered the implications. She had wanted to secure humanity's place in the galaxy, and that goal had been achieved beyond her wildest expectations. But now she was being asked to do something much larger and more complex. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course. But, Ambassador, these new species are already beginning their journey toward Council space. Whether we're prepared for them or not, first contact is going to happen within the next few months. The question is whether we'll approach them with wisdom or repeat the same patterns that have caused so many problems in the past. After the communication ended, Prince Kethvar took his wife's hand and led her back to the observation deck. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars that suddenly seemed full of infinite possibilities and challenges. What are you thinking? He asked eventually. I'm thinking about something one of the Wanderer representatives told me during those first interviews, Zara replied. He said that the galaxy is vast, and there's always more if you know how to look. I've spent the last year learning to look beyond the obvious, beyond the established assumptions about who matters and what's possible. She turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes the same quiet determination that had first attracted him to her. These new species chose to contact humans for a reason. They see something in us that they don't see in the established galactic powers. Maybe it's our youth. Maybe it's our stubbornness. Maybe it's just that we're still naive enough to believe that impossible problems can have simple solutions. Whatever it is, I think I have to find out what we can accomplish if we keep looking beyond the obvious. Prince Kethvar smiled, recognizing the tone that meant his wife had already made her decision. Then I guess we're going to the outer spiral territories. We? Did you think I was going to let you revolutionize galactic civilization without me? Besides, someone needs to be there to document the moment when the galaxy's newest members realize that they've just asked the most stubborn species in known space to represent their interests. As their ship altered course toward regions of space that had never appeared on any galactic map, Zara Chen reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had started with the simple goal of proving that humans deserved a place among the stars. Instead, she had discovered that the stars themselves were full of voices that had been waiting far too long to be heard. The universe, it turned out, was much larger, much more complex, and much more wonderful than any of them had imagined. And humanity, despite being the youngest and most inexperienced species in the galactic community, had somehow become the key to unlocking possibilities that no one had known existed. In the months that followed, as news of the outer spiral contacts spread throughout the galaxy, a new phrase began to appear in diplomatic communications across dozens of species and hundreds of worlds. When faced with problems that seemed impossible, when confronted with challenges that traditional approaches couldn't solve, when dealing with situations that required thinking beyond established patterns, beings throughout the galaxy began to ask the same question: what would the humans do? They began to discover that the answer usually involved listening to voices they had never bothered to hear, considering perspectives they had never thought to value, and finding solutions in places they had never thought to look. The galaxy had learned something profound from the species that refused to give up, and that lesson would echo through the stars for generations to come. Sometimes the most important wisdom comes not from those who have lived the longest, but from those who never stop believing that things can be better than they are. The universe was vast, full of infinite possibilities, and finally, after millions of years, its inhabitants were beginning to learn how to look.